bipartisan. Have two of you in the middle. Yeah, that's great.
Welcome. I'm Gail Sassnett, Associate Director of the Bob Graham Center. It's so good to see all of you with us here tonight. We're so fortunate to have Congressman Jolly and Murphy here tonight as they're doing a bipartisan tour of Florida discussing why gridlock rules Washington and how we can solve this crisis. After the talk, there will be time for Q&A. You know, we'll have the microphone here in the middle, and because we're streaming and recording this event, we will ask you to come forward and speak into the microphone so that others will be able to hear. And I'll remind you to turn off your cell phones. And now Dr. Dan Smith, who is the Political Science Chair here at UF, is going to introduce our speakers. Thank you, Dan.
Gail, should I take that?
Excellent.
Perfect.
You should. That's exactly.
Great. Thank you, Gail. Welcome, everyone, to the Graham Center. This is a terrific forum for what I think is going to be a lively discussion tonight, more a discussion than a talk, indeed. And so the question is, you know, in this flaky flake world that we're living in, obviously that's alluding to Senator Jeff Flake, who is anything but flaky, surprising announcement that he's sick and tired of this partisan, hyper-partisan, gridlocked environment that he is residing in when he's not in Arizona. With the prevalence of fake news and the shouting on TV, present company excluded, and can we as Americans find common ground? It's really a pressing issue today, but it was 4 years ago. Can Republicans and Democrats, is there space for them to come together? Can they help turn around the growing cynicism and apathy that we're seeing not only among millennia, but also among our retirees? I myself am probably the least politically informed that I've been in the last 30 years as a professional, because I too can't stand turning on the television or the radio and having to listen to this, and that's my job to follow it. We have two members, former members of Congress, David Jolly and Patrick Murphy, both from Florida, whose combined age is less than the median age of a U.S. senator. Wow. I did the math. Wow. It's true. Wow. During their time in Congress, Patrick Murphy, a Democrat who represented a Republican-leaning district in southeast Florida, and Representative Jolly, who represented a Democratic-leaning district in the St. Pete area, worked across the aisle on various issues, from debt reduction to climate change to community policing to federal firearms policies, including campaign finance reform, which drew considerable ire from at least Representative Jolly's own party. And they've been barnstorming the state to talk to Floridians and the broader community about how it is possible to bring this polarized nation together to allow us to move forward on policy that is not extreme at one end or the other. Congressman Jolly is a fifth-generation Floridian. He served in 2014 to 2017, won a special election after the death of his predecessor, Bill Young, who he worked many years for, representing the St. Pete Clearwater area. He considered himself a modern-day bull moose Republican, and has, again, worked in areas in policy space that is not necessarily thought of as Republican, from marriage equality to LGBTQ rights and protections, and other issues that I've already spoken about. Congressman Murphy is a former Republican who then won a very contentious race against a very polarizing Republican. I think he would even say that about himself from Cornel West. Again, in Congress during his short stint, worked at restoring funding for the Everglades, as well as tackling wasteful government spending in Washington and beyond. Again, trying to work across the aisles, these two developed a friendship, and I think you will find tonight that that continues. I'm going to turn it over to the two of them. They're going to have fairly brief comments, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. We will have a mic that will be going around, and so put your thinking caps on.
The mic will be here.
The mic will be here, but you have a short amount of time to think about some good questions. I don't want softballs, and if you're asking softballs, then I'll start throwing the high inside slider. But we have about an hour, and so take advantage of having these two very affable and very thoughtful former members of Congress who I think we probably haven't heard the last of in terms of Florida politics. So I'll turn it over. I don't know which one of you would like to start.
We flip a coin, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
He wore the tie. He goes first.
I'm trying to look older, so I wear a tie, you know. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for moderating this. I want to thank the Graham Center. Gail, thank you for helping put this together. But most of all, I want to thank you for being here, for taking some time out of your busy day and evening to come out and listen. And we really want to make this a discussion. We like to have it, be casual and hear what's on your mind. Because the truth is, we realized while we were serving in Congress that we kept getting the same exact question every single day. And that was, why is Congress so messed up? Right? What is wrong with you all? And why can't you solve these problems that seem pretty solvable for everyday people? And we tried to do what we could in Congress, and we kept doing everything we could to reach across the aisle and solve problems. And we want to share with you the kind of behind-the-curtain view of what's really going on, why things are so broken. And we believe that it is going to be in large part up to you all to get more engaged, right? To spread the word, to go to your friends and colleagues and make sure that they don't just give up and put up their hands and say, I'm done with this place, it's over, but do the opposite, right? And get more engaged. And I always like to start off with a story because I think it really puts into context just how bad things really are, right? I don't want to start off on such a bad note, but it's sort of the reality of it. So here I am, new member of Congress. It's kind of like starting college. And it was 2013. I get elected in this tough race. And they say, Patrick, welcome to Congress. Guess what? You're a Democrat, so we're going to put you in this room over here with all the Democrats. And they put all the Republicans over here. And they basically separated us. And I said, what in the world is that? If you're ever going to get to know each other, it's kind of in the beginning before you build these artificial barriers. And I was lucky enough to meet a freshman Republican from North Carolina, and we started talking one night. And we actually realized that we were agreeing on more issues, especially the fiscal issues, than we were disagreeing on. I said, wait a minute, what's wrong with these people up here? We just got here, we're already agreeing on stuff. Let's do something about it. So we put together some legislation, and we focused on wasteful, fraudulent, inefficient government spending. And over a course of several weeks, we ended up identifying over $400 billion of wasteful, fraudulent government spending. A lot of money, right? Almost $500 billion. And this is your money. This is taxpayer money. So we started putting this legislation together. We're getting ready to drop it on the House floor. And my colleague I was working with, a Republican, comes to me and he says, Patrick, look, I need another week or two to work on this bill. Some things came up. We said, oh, no problem. A couple of weeks go by, another week goes by, another week. About 6 weeks end up going by. And I see him out one evening. I'm saying, hey, what's the deal? We were supposed to do this, a month and a half ago. Why don't we drop this bill? He says, Patrick, look, he had a couple of drinks, I think, So he says, Patrick, look, Speaker of the House at the time, John Boehner, found out that we were working together on this bill. And Patrick, look, we're really trying to beat you in your district. You just won this tough seat. And if we were to do this, you might get a good headline back home. Patrick cuts wasteful spending. So look, I was basically told I'm not allowed to work with you. And if I do, I'm going to be dropped out from my committee and I'm going to be blocked from fundraising. So, hey, Patrick, if you're here in 6 years, we'll work together then. And he admitted, right, basically all of this to me. And that happened very early on, which maybe was a blessing because I realized just how broken that institution was and how many people are continuing to put their party in front of their country. And I don't say that story off the bat to be partisan because David's got the same exact story basically that a Democrat did to him. Right? It happens on both sides of the aisle, and it happens way too often. And we both went into Congress, or at least I'll say, admittedly, I went in, optimistic, naive even, that I was going to get there and pass legislation overnight and start solve these macro problems. But there are structural problems getting in the way in D.C. And that's what we want to talk to you about, because until we fix them, we're going to have the same gridlock. So, again, thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to David.
I share Patrick's gratitude to each one of you all for being here, to the University of Florida, to the Graham Center. We had very similar experiences, and one of the things we're doing on this tour is, frankly, to try to be optimistic about it. I mean, first and foremost, the fact that there is room in today's political environment for Democrats and Republicans to find common ground and to work together. And that's not a message we always hear. We also know, though, and one of the things we'll talk about tonight are some of the structural challenges to rewarding bipartisanship, right? This is not about punishing those who are so partisan, but how do we create a system as voters that begins to reward bipartisanship? And part of that, we always say, Patrick and I agree on this, we don't need to confuse bipartisanship with centrism, right? We may have a lot of centrists here tonight. We might have a lot of centrists across the country. But at the same time, it's very well and good to be a far-left progressive or a far-right conservative. The question is, why have we found ourselves in a place in 2017 where nobody seems to be able to work together and be rewarded for working together? Patrick and I had very similar experiences. The first time each of us ran for office, it was for the United States Congress. Neither one of us worked our way up through local office in county and Tallahassee and then Congress. And so for each of us, it was kind of an eyes wide open moment. When I got into my very first race, it was a special election. It wasn't a regular cycle. It was the only race in the country. And folks, when I got into the race, I was polling, are you ready for this? At 1.5%. And the margin of error was 4. And I got in with all of the optimism as Mr. Smith goes to Washington, believing that you win races knocking on doors and meeting people and with the right message. And in a time that turned out to be perhaps the most expensive race in the country for a brief period, Patrick had one as well. Georgia 06 with Ossoff crushed all those records. But in about 3 months, my wife Laura and I realized what had happened, which was we had experienced a modern national election and all of the competing influences that dictate both candidate behavior and voter behavior. And we realized both in that election and then as Patrick and I served, the impact of gerrymandering, of whether or not a district is competitive or is drawn to only protect and insulate one party. We learned the impact of open versus closed primaries. Again, in a closed primary where you're only speaking to your party, not to a broader constituency. In the state of Florida, where a third are no party affiliates. And we learned the impact of campaign finance. Both the demands of a candidate to raise money, millions of dollars, but also the impact of outside money, which truly is uncoordinated. I was thinking, Patrick and I on this journey have had the opportunity to relive a lot of experiences. And I was thinking just today, one of the lessons I learned about outside money. And it's reflected in the fact that when I was endorsed by Governor Jeb Bush in my first race, I didn't know I had been endorsed by Jeb Bush until I saw it on a TV commercial paid for by an outside group that was actually supporting me. But the lesson in that was the true independence of this outside money. We think of the outside money and how it's crushing you in opposition. But the reality is we live in an environment where even the outside groups that are supporting you are so uncoordinated with the candidate that eventually, and I think Patrick would agree with this, in 5 or 10 years we will be in an environment without change where the candidate's fundraising and the candidate's message means less and less and less and eventually means nothing because the perception of voters will be defined only by the uncoordinated outside candidate identification campaigns that are created through the big money. So we talk about a lot of things from gerrymandering to primaries to outside money. Patrick talks about the media and some other influences. Our hope, though, is not to leave discouraged, but to point to some success we've seen at the state level on how we can change the primary system, like we've seen in California and Iowa and other states, how we can change gerrymandering, like we saw in fair districts in Florida and an independent redistricting commission in Arizona. On finance, we will never reach the threshold of changing Citizens United without a Supreme Court decision, but about 75% of the problems within campaign finance can still be changed today without revisiting the Supreme Court. And our hope is in having this conversation that we identify a pathway for how each of us as voters can begin to change a system to ultimately reward those who work together, whether you're a centrist, a progressive, a conservative, or anywhere in between. So thank you all for joining us this evening. We appreciate it.
Thank you both. I have plenty of questions, but I'd rather open it up to whoever would like to come to the mic. I'm happy to start off. Questions about accountability in that outside money, where these outside groups, you may or may not know them as a candidate, you may or not know them as a voter, they're gone after the election. And yet you're left holding the bag of how you've been portrayed. Even if you win, you've been shaped by that outside money. You are owning those issues even though you may not technically own them. And so I'm wondering whether that was something that both of you who did win those tough races starting out had to deal with in terms of how the race was framed and how those perceptions carried to Washington, even though they were not necessarily part of the heart and soul of your own.
And they're vicious. They're vicious, and they're written by groups that have never been inside your district, right?
You've got a funny story about right after you got elected.
Which one? There was an ad that actually suggested I had traded arms with Pakistan. And my wife and I woke up a Sunday morning before church and saw that commercial. And the moment I saw that, I thought, this is a Will Ferrell movie right now. And I hope they spent $10 million on this ad because it was so bizarre.
Wasn't allowed in church that day, but.
But to your point, it is true because you get identified, and I'll keep this very short, but in my very first race, I had never run for office before. I had never taken a vote before. It was a highly competitive race. I was a Republican in a district President Obama had won twice. It was a 50-50 district, which I think, by the way, is great for the political system, the more competitive districts we can have. But as a result of the national parties trying to win that race, all of the outside groups came in that you would expect. So, for instance, I was told very early on, you have to join the NRA as a lifetime member. And I said, I'm not going to do that. Right? I'll fill out the scorecard, and as a Republican, I have very strong Second Amendment convictions, but I'm not going to join the NRA. I've had challenges with the NRA since the early 90s, and I just wasn't there. Nonetheless, because it was a national race, the NRA came in to support me. All of the pro-life groups came in to support me. The Chamber of Commerce came in to support me. I bet, I don't know this, but I bet the Koch brothers came in to support me. So I arrive in Washington, and the entire conservative foundation thinks, we just won Jolly this race. He's our guy. We own him. Well, if we get to spend some more time together, you will realize nobody owns my wife and I when it comes to politics. And I think no group should own any politician. So I started voting. And as I started voting, all of these outside groups who had defined me started shrinking away. And in my next race, they weren't there. And in my final race, where honestly, in the reality of politics, had they come in and spent $1 million or $2 million, I would have won. But they faded away because I wasn't a good enough 100% down the line loyalist to their agenda. And those are some of the issues that we wrestle with in Washington. It would be easy for me to have taken those votes, to be 100% with them and have their money. I chose not to.
And that is really exactly the point, that David's score might have been a 90, a 94 of some of these groups, mid-90, an A, right? Passing grade, above passing. But it wasn't good enough, not pure enough. So what happens is you have members of Congress today in office, some of which we know, who recently just took a vote that is 100% against what they think is best. We know it, they know it. And we know that they know it. But they voted against what they think is best because they know that there's tens of millions of dollars coming in, depending on the race, for them for doing that. And they are putting their own re-election, or even their own party, you could say, in front of what they think is best. And that is, of course, exactly the point of the problem with money, the epitome of what's wrong with it, is that it is corrupting people. And it is going more and more toward the extreme, right? There are no big money groups saying, wow, David, Patrick, you guys are great. You found some bipartisan bill and you introduced it. Wow, we're going to give you millions of dollars. Good job. It's the opposite. He had a 94 with some of these groups and they still didn't support it because they didn't have 100. So the incentive in Congress, whether it's on the Democratic side, the Sierra Club or something, or the Republican side, is to continue to go more to the extreme, right? And that becomes true when you start looking at other factors like gerrymandering or the media that will or won't give you attention based on how extreme you are, and some of the other factors that end up playing into this, where the extremes end up really dictating a lot of the policy. And the members of Congress realize that. And we realize that if there was like a secret ballot in Washington, like 90% of the stuff would be solved, right? All these bills would be passed, it'd be no problem. No one knew where people were voting. And there's a lot of friends of ours in Congress that aren't nearly as extreme as you might think. Right? We've traveled with them, we've gotten to know them, and it turns out they're putting a little bit of a show on. Right? There's this joke in Washington that D.C. is Hollywood for ugly people, right? Because so many of them end up being actors and actresses to pander to the money or the media, whatever it might be, and we've got to fix that.
And so let me add very briefly to that, because it's easy to kind of approach with scorn and skepticism members who say, okay, I've got to be 100% with this group so that they come in and back me. That seems to be intuitively something bad. And it is, right? But also understand this is politics, and there's no reward for moderating just 10 or 20%. And what I mean by that is, on the Planned Parenthood debate of a year or two ago, I refused to go along with my party just defunding Planned Parenthood. And so I led the effort to say, okay, where's the compromise? Let's keep women's health care services funded in underserved communities. Let's have no cut to federal funding for women's health care services. While Planned Parenthood's being investigated, whether you agree with it or not, and I voted against the investigation, but whether you agree with it or not, let's move that money to community health care centers. Frankly, it was a rational compromise on a very hard issue. What was the electoral result? In today's environment, my party abandoned me, right, because I was no longer a loyalist. But I didn't get a pat on the back from the Democrats. The Democrats already had their position. And so I end up running a race where Republicans destroy me for not being good enough on the issue. And though I tried to strike a compromise, the Democrats destroy me for defunding Planned Parenthood. And it leaves those who try to forge compromise in this neverland in the middle, where you really don't have the allies. And that's what Patrick and I are trying to get at.
All right, I am not going to hog the stage. I am going to ask only one more question, but I need to have someone step up to that mic before I do. I need to see some movement there. I know you can ask better questions than I can. All right, so the question I'm going to ask as we get people up here is there a sense of liberation, do you think, going through the minds of a Jeff Flake or a Bob Corker, senator from Tennessee, or a John McCain, who obviously has his own personal health issues to worry about, much less an election in 6 years? Is there something that we should expect from the fact that they are now saying, I'm term limiting myself out, I'm not going to run? Are we going to see more honesty on the floor of the U.S. Senate, like we saw with John McCain, with these two members now who have said, I don't have to worry about appeasing the donors. I can speak my conscience.
No.
And again, not just with those two individual members, but more generally, do you think there's a possibility, or are we going to see Jeff Flake move back and vote 94%, 95% with the Republican Party as he's traditionally done?
I think what Jeff Flake has done and Senator McCain and Senator Corker, what they've done, has shown a lot of integrity. And regardless of how they voted in the past, and I think they've always tried to stick to what they believe in, but I would believe going forward what you're going to see is them continuing to do what they think is right. Whether that's left, right, whatever percent it is, but speaking their mind, truth to what is happening there. And Jeff Flake sort of alluded and indicated he thinks there will be more of this happening because, and I don't know if anybody had a chance to read his statement and his op-ed he wrote in the Washington Post. It was worth a couple of minutes for you all to read it. Borderline moving, I would say, for a sitting senator for re-election to not seek re-election and to say, by being quiet is being complicit in this. And history will judge the actions of Republicans and Democrats right now if they are silent for what's happening. There is no place in history for what's happening with this administration, right? You can talk about the issues, you can talk about the policies, that's one thing. But the behavior, right, the rhetoric, the hateful, name-calling, everything else that's coming out of this administration has no place, has nothing to do with what we were founded upon. And I think that is just the tip of the iceberg for what's happening, because as David would say, and knows this probably better than I do, our colleagues, and obviously the Democrats are against this administration, but my Republican friends, I was just up there Monday, are embarrassed in large part and quietly behind closed doors having the same conversations my Democratic friends are having. We're starting to see some of them get the courage to say this publicly, though. And I think that means something for the shift, hopefully, that's going to be for the better.
So I think Patrick's largely right. To your question, though, I don't think we're going to see their voting records change, right? Flake is still a conservative. Corker is still a conservative. McCain still largely is a conservative. They are conservatives who don't recognize a president, though, that is leading their party as representing conservative values, and that's what they're speaking out against. I would say the measure of their courage and the measure of their mettle, the measure of their integrity, is not about what they've done this week, but it's what they do going forward. Because it is very easy to say I'm leaving, but as somebody who went to the House floor and called on this president to drop out of the presidential race after the Muslim ban, they are now facing a question. Jeff Flake said to his hometown newspaper, I don't know if there's a place for me in this Republican Party. I had that same question. I wrestle with that every single day. But I know there's not a place for a mainstream conservative in the Democratic Party. In Nancy Pelosi's party, there certainly isn't. So I've chosen to stay and to fight for what I think conservative ideals should be in the Republican Party. Do Corker and McCain and Flake take this moment as a moment of retirement and leave the stage, or do they stay and fight? And I will say this as a Republican who thinks we need them to stay and fight, because the future of the party, forget about the presidency for a moment and the fate of the country, the future of the party will be determined by what follows Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump ultimately wins this battle, it will be a party that, as Jeff Flake said yesterday, he doesn't recognize. And we have to face the question whether the party stays together or fractures. What Bob Corker speaks to is a much more ominous tone, as the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee questioning the fitness of a commander-in-chief. And that's where I think it is a fair conversation to be had. And what happened with Corker this week is less about the spotlight he put on the president and but more about the spotlight he put on Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and his colleagues as to whether they empower or begin to constrain this president.
All right, I saw some movement. Great. Please just tell us who you are and then ask the question.
Hello, yes. My name is Ben Grubbs. I'm a current junior at UF. And my question was, what are some things in the process of drawing congressional districts that we as citizens may not know, and what are some steps you would take to address them, if there are any issues that you have?
So in each congressional district, or some of the problems in?
Just kind of how they're drawn, because I mean, we talk a lot about gerrymandering and what kind of the problems are, and what we as citizens don't know that you as congressmen would.
Yeah, Ben, great question. And this is something that Dave and I spend most of our time probably talking about, because I always point to 6, 7 big issues that I think have led to the gridlock we have. And it's tough to pick the number one, but if I had to pick one, I would say gerrymandering is the single biggest problem. And I'll just do rough math here for you to kind of put it in perspective. About 90% of congressional districts are predetermined, right? Out of 435 seats, 90% are predetermined. They're going to be Republican or they're going to be Democratic. We basically know that. And if you're in one of those seats, say you're in a safe Democratic seat, the only election that matters is your primary, right? Because no Republican's going to beat you in the general election. You already know that. So you got to win a primary. Well, how do you win a primary? Guess the average turnout in your primary in a congressional seat. About 15%, right? So 15% of the country determining 90% of your members of Congress, right? So who are those 15%? Right? Typically, not always, but typically they're more passionate, more extreme in many cases on the left or on the right who are actually showing up to vote. Now, as a member of Congress or as a candidate for office, say you want to run in one of those seats, you know who those 15% are. You're getting ready to go work for 16 months as a candidate, right? You're going to go door to door. You're going to make phone calls, everything you do. Are you going to appeal to the 85% who don't vote or the 15% that do? So you're going to look at that 15%, obviously. And you're going to look at how they voted in the past, right? When they showed up. You're going to look at the magazines they read and the websites they go to and where they're from. And right, you're going to get this whole fancy algorithm and come up with pretty much, pretty good certainty how they're going to vote and the issues they care about. And then those are going to be things you go and talk about. And as it turns out, it might not be something you care that much about or you're as passionate about, but you know what motivates them. So then you go and you motivate them and you win. Now you get to office. Wow, this is great, I'm going to change the world. Gosh, I got to get reelected in 2 years from now, and that's that same 15% going to show up. I better cater to them. And I'm going to keep catering to that 15%. And then what happens is you're in one of these safe seats, and you decide to go work with David Jolly, right, or Mitch McConnell, or whatever it is on an issue. And next thing you know, your Democratic base starts calling you a fake Democrat. All of a sudden, you're no longer wanted in the party. And then you will be primaried, and then you'll probably lose. So I'm somewhat simplifying it, but basically those are the conversations that most members of Congress have because they know what it takes to get reelected.
So, real life example. The top issues of those 15% are not tax reform and the economy and job growth. It's build a wall, Obamacare, and guns. And so we see candidates that are defined by those issues, even though those may not be the defining issues of the broader society. Something to think about with gerrymandering, and this is an issue that I care deeply about and can get very wonky about, but I would ask you, if you leave with only one thought about tonight, consider how gerrymandering works. State legislatures determine the district lines for Congress. So Tallahassee draws the lines for Congress. And they naturally draw, if it's a Republican-controlled legislature, they want to protect Republican seats in Congress. We saw a fair districts movement move through through Florida successfully. A lot of court challenges, but ultimately, voters said, we want district lines that are geographically compact. Right? We grow up thinking gerrymandering is wrong. Remember the success of what voters did in this situation. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said if voters change the districting system through geographic compactness or in Arizona requiring independent districts, that's constitutional. The one thing I would point out to think about, geographic compactness is naturally fair. We all agree on that. I always make the case, though, that perhaps states should consider, voters should consider putting into state constitutions a requirement for electoral competitiveness of districts. If our districts were drawn as close to 50-50 as possible, we would never talk about term limits again. Because term limits rooted in that is ultimately a question of accountability. And the reality is if 90% of the districts are so safe for one party or the other, those members are never held accountable by their entire district, only by their party. If we made them compete every 2 years, we could hold them accountable as voters. So we will never achieve pure 50-50 districts, right? In Brooklyn, there's one that favors Democrats by 46 points. Deep in the heart of red Texas, there's one that favors Republicans by 43 points. But if we were to require, in addition to geographic compactness, electoral competitiveness, that's something voters can do right now to disrupt gerrymandering and disrupt the consolidation of powers that majority parties in state capitals have created across all 50 states.
It's no accident that these two members, former members of Congress, came from two of the most competitive districts in Florida.
Right.
They wouldn't be here if they were from those districts that are solid Republican or solid Democrat.
And to your point, we had to wake up every day thinking about our entire community, not just our party. And that's only 10% of the Congress that has to do that.
Now, Florida, prior to the fair districting and the amendments that were passed in 2010 and then were finally put in through the state Supreme Court, has led to more of these competitive districts. And it's going to be interesting to see how those members who are fighting for life, especially down in South Florida, 25 and 26 and 27, as well as others, are going to continue. But the one factor that you didn't mention, although you alluded to, was that we have closed primaries. And that accentuates that 15%, as opposed to having the 27% of no party affiliates being excluded from the process right now in terms of who is going to be the Republican or Democratic nominee in the competitive, much less the non-competitive ones. It's just the diehard Republicans or Democrats who are participating in this. And so what can we do in terms of moving forward on that front?
Same exact thing.
Thanks, Ben.
Voters can change that today. In California, voters moved to a jungle primary where the top two move forward. This is another area. In Florida, in 2020, we likely will see a ballot initiative to require open primaries or blanket primaries to let the top two go. What we're talking about is giving all voters the right to participate in candidate selection. I will say one thing about fair districts, and hopefully folks from League of Women Voters that worked on fair districts are here. Thank you for getting involved in that. It is a net good, there's no question. But I always want to point out, in the name of geographic compactness, we ultimately put in jeopardy the four most centrist districts, right? Gwen Graham, who is a Democrat representing a Republican district, myself, a Republican representing a Democratic district, Patrick's district, Curbello's. Geographic compactness is a fair test for fairness, but it actually threw out the most competitive districts in the state. So not to suggest we overturn it, but it is important to revisit how we measure fairness in the state.
And just so everyone knows kind of the numbers, about 1/3 of Florida isn't registered as a Republican or Democrat, right? They're registered as in PA. So for that group there, it is actually growing, right? About twice as fast as Republicans and Democrats. And a lot of those folks, of course, are millennials who are growing up looking at two parties that are basically dysfunctional. Saying, why am I going to join these two groups, right? What am I thinking? No way. So they're now, not able to vote in these primaries in the majority of their congressional seats. And so we're accentuating the problem there. And if it continues on this pace for another 10, 15 years, when those millennials are by far going to be the bulk group of voters, we're going to have a real problem because who's going to be left voting?
Yes.
Hi, my name's Geneva. I'm a student here at UF, and we talked a lot about the problems that are present in Washington, but is there anything that our representatives can do to address these problems and create solutions?
Great question. So, a lot of the things that need to change have to, in many ways, be started with some groups of people, ballot initiatives in many cases. One of the things that members of Congress could do has to do with the money component, a constitutional amendment. The reality is the numbers just aren't there right now, and it would take some major swing elections for the numbers to be there right now. But members of Congress, let me point this out because we always end up getting to this, is that members of Congress more often than not are followers. And you could say about most politicians, they follow the constituents that are out there. Very few go out on a limb and are bold for something for years because they don't last very long. So they end up following the public. So all of a sudden, if you decide to get a group of your friends and colleagues together and you start a movement, and you get 100 people, then you get 1,000 people, then you get 5,000 people to start emailing your member of Congress or the president or whomever it is at any level, it could be a commissioner, all of a sudden you're probably going to see that person responding. In my office, I would get between 800 and 1,200 letters or emails, phone calls a week, right? And I would get a report every single week and say, look, 90% of the phone calls we got this week were on X issues, on healthcare, on the environment. And whether I agreed or not, I at least knew in my head this is where the pulse of my community is. I know what people are thinking. So all of a sudden you can make real changes. Those letters, I don't think in our offices, they certainly didn't go ignored. So you can start a lot of these changes with gerrymandering, with money, with the media, with some of the other issues.
Yeah, look, the exciting thing is voters today can start to change gerrymandering and primary systems. We've seen that across the country, and we've seen the Supreme Court affirm it. In Congress, what we can hold members' feet to the fire on is campaign finance. They will say Citizens United is a Supreme Court decision, that's true, but there are value judgment reform proposals. I had one to prohibit members of Congress from directly soliciting money. Patrick talks about narrowing the window of fundraising time to 60 or 90 days. There are proposals to prohibit lobbyists from directly soliciting money or contributing money. Voters can change 70% of the problems we face right now through ballot initiatives. Members of Congress can change the other 25%. The Supreme Court really just has a stranglehold on Citizens United. Everything else is stuff we can change right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi there, my name is Garen. My question is about, both of you talked about how there's outside groups that have influence using their money to influence races. My question is, what advice would you give to young candidates that aren't looking to take money from these groups or looking for that help, that want to stay true to their values? What advice would you give them in still being able to win their election while staying true to their values? Thank you.
Great question, and I think David and I have proven through our votes, and maybe not being in office, that we've stayed true to our values. We probably could have sold out, and knowing what sort of the tea leaves are for where that money is. So it's my point is that you can do it. Don't worry about that. Follow your heart. Follow what you believe is right, and always do that, and you will succeed. There is, I think, a growing evidence that some of the low dollar, small dollar contributions, we saw it early on, I think, with President Obama, we saw it for sure with Bernie Sanders, that you're starting to see maybe not an equal movement to the Koch brothers and the big money groups, but sort of the online movement that usually follows the energy. And a candidate that has a certain amount of energy and has a certain message that appeals to a group can end up raising, the resources necessary to get your message out in $5 and $10, $15 contributions that add up to millions of dollars or whatever the particular race is that's needed. So don't think by any stretch that you need to get that big money. You need a message, right? You need the passion, you need the convictions, and then you need those people that believe in you. And then you can start to get those resources to get that message out.
Do you think that focusing on the local races would be a good way to address that?
Meaning that?
Meaning that those that are running for local elections, especially now after this election, we've seen so many new-time candidates, particularly a lot of new women that are running for office. Do you think that supporting those candidates would be a good way of addressing that issue?
It can't hurt, no doubt. And whether it's a local candidate, a federal candidate, looking at some of these new candidates, and everyone can make a difference. I'm not advocating for more money or anything by any stretch, but those $10 donations and those $5 recurring contributions, they do add up. Just like voting, it does add up and makes a difference.
I'll tell you one of my races. I was leaving voting on election day, and Laura and I live in a very small town, and 2 city council candidates were outside shaking hands. One of them was packing up, and there was 45 minutes to go, and he said, "I'm done. There's no more voters coming out tonight." We go to our election night. Fortunately, we won. I look at the screen. That guy lost by 1 vote, 321 to 320. So there was no money influence in that race. I would say on money, money is always going to follow a candidate's ideology and a candidate's position. The question is, at what point does that candidate give into their own, sacrifice their own conviction to attract more of that money? And so I'm an eternal optimist. I think if you get in with the right message, resources will follow. What Patrick and I are talking about is trying to unrig the system and equal the playing field a little bit, right? In a perfect world, if I could write it, we would take all TV commercials, all political commercials off TV, and give candidates 20 minutes of candidate hour on public television where taxpayers are already spending $400 million a year to support public television. That right there would take out 90% of the cost driver of major campaigns. I wouldn't be discouraged by the money issue. You can win. Frankly, we saw Bernie compete. Local races, certainly you can be more effective because the determinant factor of money simply is not what it is in national races.
Yes.
Hi, Matt. I'm a poli-sci freshman. And
Wait. Matt is with the UF College Democrats,
yes.
Right? We were asked to give a
School,
plug,
yeah.
but he has to give a plug. I can't.
Instagram, Twitter, go follow them.
All right, I just wanted to know what you two think, if it's more effective to try to change the practices of Washington and the hyper-partisanship of our elected officials, or to try to change the hyper-partisanship of voting, and like the voting public, who seem so easily swayed by ads and outside groups.
Yeah, I mean, they go hand in hand. They in a sense, follow each other. So I think both are important to the extent that you can influence your network of friends, that you can influence perhaps where they're getting their information, to maybe give them a counter view, whether they're left or right, to give them the more balanced approach, while simultaneously working with your elected officials, at all levels, and writing them a letter, emailing them, calling, to make sure they know what you're thinking. Both can make a difference.
I would say, and this gets very boring and academic, but think about the issues we've talked about on gerrymandering and closed primary systems and how that pushes people far away. And here's a real-life example. When I was a Republican representing a district that President Obama had won twice, there was a bit of an electoral reward for me, if you will, for speaking to convictions I had on equality and on climate change, on reasonable gun measures, on environmental protection, right? Because it was a competitive district, and I was willing to take the risk to not follow my party line, hoping I was giving voice to a broader constituency. And in a 50-50 district, that worked. But once it was redrawn to one that favored a party by 10, there was no longer any electoral reward for either one of us to speak to bipartisanship. And so though it seems nuanced, and it seems a little academic, really do think about how we could change candidates and voter behavior today if we studied the gerrymandering issue to create competitive districts, if we study the primary system to open up primaries, to give a third of voters a voice now, to look at campaign finance issues. This is the grunt work in politics, if you will, but this is the opportunity to change things. It's not about punishing people who are progressive or conservative, like we said at the beginning, but how do we create a system that rewards people for finding a way to work together?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I'm the president of Gators for No Labels, which is a bipartisan club on campus. As far as I know, we're the only one on campus. Thank you both for being here today. My question is, in the past presidential election, especially in the sides of the Republicans, why is it that people don't want to vote for candidates who are near the center or are more bipartisan than others? Why aren't people voting bipartisan?
A quick question before I answer. Did you say No Labels?
Yes.
Is it affiliated with the National No Labels?
Yeah, we're a chapter.
Chapter.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Were you a member of that?
I was not.
Sorry to put you on the spot. I was a member of it. Good organization.
Absolutely.
So I think that has to do with some of these factors we're outlining. The money is going to follow oftentimes the people that are going to win, which often being these gerrymandered districts, they're going to be more extreme. But we haven't talked about media yet, so let me maybe speak to that. There's a saying in the press that they don't report the plane that lands on time. Right? It's not newsworthy. That plane landed on time in Orlando. Okay, great. Now, something bad happens to a plane, right, it's probably going to be reported. And the same thing with the press. We go make a deal, we get something done, yeah, whatever. But when there's fireworks, when there's drama, Jeff Flake-ish, or whatever it might be, a fight, a tweet, and this is obviously something that President Trump understood better than most in modern politics, that it's not even the 24-hour news cycle that we're mad at, it's the 24-minute news cycle, where you can constantly change the narrative every hour, right? Send a new tweet out, do something outrageous, and kept changing the narrative and reminding people of your name, right? That whole name ID thing, that matters. President Trump understood that really, really well, where he was being talked about, and that, at the end of the day, is what mattered, because most voters, unfortunately, are low information voters, right? A lot of people in my district don't know probably the details of work I want to do for tax reform or Social Security and Medicare. They go, Patrick Murphy, I remember that name, I saw that. I'll fill that box
I
out.
actually lived in your district.
Did you vote for him?
I wasn't old.
Good answer.
We got a politician.
Details. Yeah. Early and often. Come on, man.
One thing I would encourage you to think about is to talk about the primary system again. It is very akin to how the Electoral College works versus the popular vote. You can look at John McCain's run for presidency And there are races where he got more total votes, but because those were only in open primary states versus closed primary states, he lost the nomination. That is a huge impact, and that defines the messaging. And, look, you can look at our current president, and I think it's a very objective, analytical statement to suggest this is a person who came to the race with very little ideological conviction, right? He had been a Democrat, he was a Republican, he was a deal maker. He chose to message to a very specific base in a closed primary, hyper-partisan party that got him to the 35% of the votes he needed. This is not somebody who won the heart and soul of the party, or 51%. And so those are issues when we look at the primary systems within states that push candidates on both sides, right, on the Democratic side as well, to message to the extremes.
And just to keep going with the press just for a second,
Sure.
the press, I believe, is becoming more and more rigid, more and more polarized, right? Whether that's MSNBC and Fox,
Absolutely.
who aren't, for sure giving the same facts, but also don't report the same stories. So if you're an MSNBC viewer, you might not see something on Fox, and vice versa. And you think back, 30, 40 years ago, when there was something going on in the news, there were 3 stations, right? ABC, NBC, CBS, and we all basically got the same set of facts, same information. I know I wasn't alive, David. I knew you'd give me that look. I read about it. But there was the same basic set of facts out there. And then you can make your political partisan decision on that basic information. So now we know what's happening today in TV. But what's getting worse is social media, right? And apps and online news sources that are even more tailored, more rigid to what you believe. And if that's not bad enough, they know exactly, right? We've seen this on Instagram, Twitter, what's happening on Facebook with this last election, that they can target you so well based on your likes, based on the, all the information you're showing them about the clothes you like and the food you eat and where you're from and all that information. So they're going to make sure you're getting a very specific feed of information that then is going to, reinvigorate your current beliefs, and you become more and more rigid. You never even see the other side. So the press, I think, is actually making us more partisan and more likely to support someone that is arguably more extreme.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real irony in all of this, in that when we move towards the type of individualized targeting prior to this last election cycle, politicians could actually be held accountable because we knew those ads were being micro-targeted because they were still within groups. We knew who they were targeting. We knew that if a member of Congress was targeting this constituency and another, and there were different messages, they could be held up. What we found out in this last election cycle is that it was down to micro-targeting within households even, and that we didn't even know that there were different messages being made within Facebook or within Twitter or within other social media. And that is really something that I'm not sure Citizens United or changes at that level with this new technology and how we get our news that can be exploited for those partisan appeals.
Let me give you a real-time example for people who use social media, and this has nothing to do with Russia or any of the interference.
So
in the
you
election.
think?
So I think.
You're not sure.
And I consider myself a relatively sophisticated student of politics, and I read news on social media. I'll be honest, if there's a Republican in charge, I'll look at left-leaning media. If there's a Democrat in charge, I'll look at right-leaning media. I'm always trying to learn. So I have become a student of left-leaning media, and whether or not you think it's left or center or whatever you think of it, I'm often on MSNBC talking about issues that are critical of the president. What has happened on my Twitter platform is all I see today are left-leaning progressive views. So I'm a Republican, but because I'm kind of engaging in this independent thought, I'm not seeing traditional Republican messages. And here's how it plays out, and this is really a warning of sorts. About a week ago, I made a comment on a primetime show that questioned whether or not divided government would provide more stability right now. Right? So Democrats thought, this is great. A former Republican is saying, maybe we should have divided government. Maybe Democrats should control the House in 2018. I expected to get destroyed by Republicans. I did, but I didn't see it in Twitter. You know what I saw on Twitter? David, you're great. David, you're great. David, you're great. All these great stories from Huffington Post and MSNBC and all these sites that are feeding me the information I've been looking at. Now, in my situation, I hopefully was smart enough to realize I've got a lot of angry Republicans in me right now. But I never saw that. And so, to your more casual news consumer, it's this self-affirming process. And so I say that only because as much as we know about the algorithms, I've never seen something as extreme as that. On a night where I angered probably 95% of Republicans, I never received a single word of criticism on my Twitter newsfeed. All I received was affirmation.
There was another David Jolly who got all that irony. We have 4 questions left. I think that's probably appropriate to 3 questions left to get through and respect the members of Congress's time. So, yes.
Good evening, gentlemen. With regards to yesterday, when I was watching Senator Flake's speech, I was thinking he was almost writing the next forward for the Profiles in Courage, whenever that comes out.
Well, so he's already done, homage to Goldwater, so why not?
And I've been thinking that I think it's generally fair. This is just an opinion that I'm going to have to put out, but there's a lot of people who want accountability from the outside, from the Senate, from the House, from the new sources, whether the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, whatever you're reading, of the administration, of the president, to see people to speak truth to power. But in the administration, I think there might be a different angle on it, because there's the idea of the axis of adults with the Secretary of State, with the Director of the CIA, the Secretary of Defense, kind of a caveat on the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, but also the Chief of Staff himself. How do you think, as former members of Congress, those individuals should act? Because I think if they do speak truth to power, as we saw from Gary Cohn, they kind of lose that influence to help serve the country from inside the administration. Do you think there's a certain line that those individuals should be walking, and how they should balance that? Like any idea that you would have from your experience in Washington for those people inside the administration versus it's just a bit easier, I think, to criticize from outside. If you could speak to that.
It's a great question, and yeah, we could probably make a good case on either side of that. I hope they pray a lot, first of all, because on one hand, you probably want some cooler minds, some well-experienced folks in whatever field they come from to be around the president. We've all heard the remarks. I don't know how true they are. I would venture to say they are. Whether they're, was Tillerson calling the president a moron, the babysitting comments, all of those. I think, and knowing General Dunford a little bit and knowing people that know some of the other folks, they feel a certain sense of responsibility for the sake of the country, that they have to be in the room around him and fear what would come after them. I'm an optimist, so I'm erring on that side that that's what's going on. I think there's probably a certain amount of ego and all that goes into it, but I think there's a point now where they do want to surround the president and give him a certain viewpoint that might not be there if they were to leave. But then again, there's a good argument that history could judge them for being complicit in certain behaviors, tweets that are going on. Ultimately, I don't know if there's an easy answer to that, though.
I agree largely with Patrick. Look, I think each of them, by having a very informed military career, are certainly engaging in sober advice to the president, whether he accepts it or not. And notwithstanding the comments of General Kelly in the last week, I do think each of them recognize that when it comes to matters of national security, should we end up in that situation, they do have a higher calling than that of just loyalty to the president. And so as we live in an environment, which we have lived through as a country before, where we have irascible presidents, we have volatile presidents, we have had angry presidents, whether you agree with every decision of the generals or not, I do think we should find some comfort in knowing that we have people who understand matters of national security so close to the decisions being made by the president and have the opportunity to intervene. In a political world, if we were to see them step back, I think that would be a matter of concern and might be a matter of messaging by some of the generals. In law, it's called noisy withdrawal. If you have a client who is engaging in fraud on the court or breaking of a law, the attorney is required to step back. I think if we were to reach a moment of national security decision-making, you will see the generals either act very affirmatively or withdraw in a noisy way that leads to greater accountability by the Congress.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, good evening. My name is Kaylin. I'm the Public Relations Director of the Political Science Honor Society, and I'm studying journalism and political science. So it's kind of interesting to hear your account on the media from that side of the aisle. My question is, before it was mentioned that you guys think that 70% roughly of the problems with big money in politics could be, solved without having to overturn Citizens United, and not just with ballot initiative and stuff like pertaining to gerrymandering, but what could the public do to kind of combat and go against these big corporations who have, that can easily win over public's votes?
Can I take this for a second? So Patrick and I were on a phone call with a billionaire nationally who wanted to put money into an advocacy campaign in Florida for a gun control initiative. And he was going to put $50 or $100 million in to try to change gun laws in Tallahassee. And he was quickly told by organizers who supported his initiative that it's a waste of money until you change gerrymandering and primaries. And so I say that not to be discouraging, but to be encouraging. What can we do? Truly, the hard work that we saw League of Women Voters do on fair amendments or on fair districts is a way to begin to reset the playing field, unrig the system, so that we can change the real hard issues, campaign finance being one. Once we have a more balanced representation in our legislatures, we can approach some of these harder issues.
So it all starts with gerrymandering, you think?
Well, yeah, I guess the point is that it's not like we can't find a solution to tax reform, to reducing the debt, to immigration, to healthcare, to all the climate change, all the big macro issues that are out there that Congress, I believe, should be addressing, education, whatever it might be. It's that there are forces incentivizing members of Congress not to agree and, in fact, to go to their bases, right? And that's what we're pointing to. Unless we fix those structural problems, we're not going to see progress on any of these issues. And you might see a brave member of Congress shoot Corker and McCain here and there staying out for whatever reason on an issue or on a vote and be bold. That's one member of Congress on one issue on one day. To get the odds of getting them all to line up on many days in a row and put their neck on the line is very challenging. So that's why, in many ways, we're trying to advocate to fix these structural problems. So we talked about the gerrymandering, we talked about the money, talked about the media being more extreme, more tailored, more rigid. The fourth one, primaries. Another one I always point to is the lack of relationships. Right? Members of Congress don't know each other anymore. 30 years ago, members of Congress would move there with their families and their kids, and they'd play golf, and they'd go hunting and fishing, whatever. They were friends. You're a Republican, I'm a Democrat, who cares? We were friends. That made it more likely to get legislation done. That's all gone. Another issue that has led to the gridlock is all the cameras, which I originally would have said is a great thing for Congress. I want transparency. I want to know what my member of Congress is saying in committee. Well, when there's a camera on, members of Congress are acting. And so what happens is they start playing a part to the camera. And then when the cameras are off, they go behind closed doors. That's when the real discussion happens. So that's actually made it even worse in many cases. It's sort of backfired. And many point to Newt Gingrich in '94 weaponizing those cameras in all the committees, making sure members of Congress were always going home to campaign all the time. So if you can address some of these structural problems, and any single one of them will make a difference. If you can address them all as an individual, you can see some real change.
And if I could, I know we're wrapping up, but a great example, Patrick and I had a radio interview last week, and one of the questions, rapid fire, does the NRA own the Republican Party? And I think we both said yes, right out of the gate. A reporter, though, said no. The Republican Party is just reflecting their supermajority districts that they represent. And I think that was a pretty fair point, right? Certainly the money of advocacy groups, whether it's a pro-gun group or a gun control group, influences. But if you peel back the fact that members are insulated by supermajority red districts on that issue or supermajority blue districts, that defines voting behavior more than the outside money, and we can fix that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mateo Hadar. I'm a freshman here at UF. and I do some work here with the Graham Center. To add kind of to some of the other questions about kind of going forward and actions that can be taken, how do you envision, because you mentioned that it's a tour that you're doing, a concerted and kind of tangible effort from the part of the public following the tour? And what are some of the issues and solutions that you would consider are more accessible to tackle? And would you consider kind of outlining some of those for going forward with kind of more of a concrete plan?
That's a great last question, Gail. Thank you.
Yeah, and we've been somewhat careful not to just get behind a particular ballot initiative or another. Personally, I would argue that all of the above on gerrymandering or money is helpful. There's some I feel stronger about. We both, I think, feel pretty strong about what California did. Starting off with somewhat of an independent panel to draw the congressional districts. There's different ways to look at that, but taking out of the hands of elected officials in Tallahassee, and then doing a more independent, less gerrymandered district to start with, but then having a system that's called the top two system. If you all are familiar with this, basically what it means is in your first election, that primary, the top two finishers move on to the next. It could be two Republicans, could be two Democrats, an R and a D, doesn't matter. Those top two people move on. So, let's just say California's case, right, more Democratic leaning, say two Democrats move on. Well, you have perhaps one Democrat that's way to the left, another one that's more in the middle. Well, that one in the middle and the one on the left are now both going to be incentivized to go back to the middle and get some of those Republicans and independents and moderates and start talking about making things happen than they are to go to the extreme. So what you've seen is a budget get passed in California. It hasn't happened in many years. You're starting to see some indications of behavior going more sort of converging in the middle in many districts because you have an independently drawn district and you have an incentive to go to the middle. So that would be something that we could probably both get behind.
Yeah, so very quickly I'd say first think about what you're doing to participate in 18 and 20. Right, now's the time. We are living in a political environment like we have rarely seen. Whether you support the agenda of the president or you oppose it, think about how you're going to evolve in 18 or 20. The encouraging thing, we've talked about the fact that primaries have been changed by voters in many states. Gerrymandering has been changed by voters in many states. In Florida, we saw a change happen just a few years ago. We're going to see in 2020 open primaries on the ballot. Here's the piece that's encouraging. You don't have to go back to your apartment or your dorm room or your home and start that initiative today. In many of these areas, those groups are already organized and already working. So whatever you leave with today or what you came with and you feel more inspired about, if it's campaign finance, districts, primaries, if it's an ideological agenda, look at groups that are already doing that. Right? There's a campaign finance group called Issue 1 that's working on something. Common Cause is working on something. A number of groups are working this gerrymandering issue. Perhaps identify not just what you're going to do about 18 and 20 for your candidates of choice, but how are you going to get involved in some of these movements that are changing the structures of electoral politics. Ultimately, what Patrick and I are trying to create is a more accountable system that gives voters more voice and rewards our leaders, our elected leaders, for finding the consensus that brings more of us together than where we are today. Because if we continue down this path without change, we will get in a very divisive environment that we will no longer recognize. When Jeff Flake said, I don't know if I have a place in today's party, whether he said that as a Republican in today's Republican Party or a Democrat in today's Democrat Party, the lesson I took from that was for each of us who see a party or a system we don't recognize today, if we don't speak up now, we're never going to recognize it again. And that's why Patrick and I are engaging in the statewide tour. It's why we thank you for being with us tonight, and hopefully together we're going to see some change here in the future.
I can't think of a better conversation that reflects the spirit of the Graham Center and of Governor Graham himself than what we've heard tonight. And let's have a nice Graham Center. Thank you. Good luck with his moving around. I think this is my first email. I don't know. Congressman Jeffrey Washington Schultz along with Congressman Rudy are going to be there.
You did.
It's election day in Virginia.
Okay.
But we're doing it right before then.
Okay.
Great.
Sorry.
Okay.
Fan club over here.
Yeah, just send us a message on Facebook.
Okay.
Is there an invite?
I will send you an email. I've got a